The Adventures of Assal in Non-Spherical Bubbles. Prologue, The Mystery Beyond the Sphere. Assal had always known there were things she would never understand. Life was full of questions without answers, and perhaps that was the point. But one question had lingered in her mind ever since she was a child. Why are bubbles always round? The simplicity of it gnawed at her. No matter what shape she tried to mold them into, triangles, squares, or stars, the bubbles would resist and collapse into perfect, predictable spheres. It fascinated and frustrated her in equal measure, as if the universe were teasing her with its stubborn logic. Her father, always amused by her restless curiosity, would laugh whenever she tried to explain this obsession. "One day, you'll find a bubble that doesn't follow the rules," he would say with a wink, "and when you do, it will change everything." His words were a promise, or maybe just a joke. But they had stayed with her, floating on the edge of her thoughts long after he was gone. Now, years later, they felt less like a riddle and more like a challenge she couldn't ignore. The night he died, she stood alone on the balcony, watching bubbles drift from the soap bottle she had knocked over. They shimmered in the cold air, tiny worlds of iridescent light, rising and bursting in delicate silence. Perfect, always perfect. Even in her grief, the bubbles refused to change. Since then, the thought of those bubbles had haunted her. They seemed to mock her with their simplicity, a symbol of all the things she could never control or understand. It was more than just a scientific question, it had become personal, a reminder of everything unfinished, everything unresolved. But what if there were places where things weren't perfect, where bubbles formed into cubes, cones, or pyramid shapes that defied the smooth elegance of spheres? What if her father had been right all along? The idea simmered in the back of her mind, stirring her curiosity in ways she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about understanding how the universe worked, it was about finding something different, something that broke the rules, something that would make sense in a world where nothing else did. That was when the invitation arrived. Dr. Ilara Voss, the brilliant physicist whose work danced on the edges of madness, had reached out with a proposition that was impossible to resist. "I have found a way to travel beyond our universe," Voss had written, "to places where geometry takes on new forms and the laws we know no longer apply. If you are ready to explore the unimaginable, meet me at the observatory." Assal reread the message until the words blurred on the screen. Voss was offering her more than just an answer to a childhood question. She was offering a chance to step beyond the familiar, to follow the mystery to its source. For a moment, fear flickered at the edges of her mind. Leaving behind everything she knew would be terrifying, but staying in a world bound by predictable spheres, that was worse. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Find the bubble that doesn't follow the rules, Assal. It will change everything." And so she closed the laptop, her mind made up. She would find the bubbles that refused to be spheres. She would step into the unknown, and in doing so, maybe she would finally find what she had been searching for all along. Chapter 1. The Call to Adventure. Assal leaned against the windowsill, the city below flickering with life. Lights blinked on and off like restless neurons, yet none of it touched the quiet storm building inside her. Ever since she was young, Assal had questioned everything, why things were the way they were, why the sky remained boundless yet predictable, why bubbles, of all things, always formed into perfect spheres no matter how she tried to shape them with her hands. It irritated her. How could perfection be so simple? And why did things insist on being exactly the way they were? That evening, her mind drifted to the conversations she used to have with her father, the person who understood her restlessness better than anyone. They'd spend hours talking about how the universe might have hidden layers, places where the rules they knew were broken and rewritten. He'd tease her, saying, "One day you'll find the right bubble, Assal, one that doesn't insist on being round." The loss of her father was still fresh. It wasn't just his absence that haunted her, but the questions he left behind, hanging unfinished between them. The idea of bubbles beyond spheres of worlds where things didn't align with the rules she knew began to feel less like a curiosity and more like a need. A need to prove to herself, and maybe to him, that such places existed. When the message from Dr. Ilara Voss arrived, Assal stared at the words on her screen, feeling the weight of a decision hanging in the air. Voss was a name she knew well, a brilliant but eccentric physicist whose theories about alternate geometries were the stuff of both ridicule and admiration in the scientific community. Assal, the message read, I have something that might interest you. There are places beyond what we've ever imagined, and I need someone with your curiosity to join me. The journey won't be easy, but I promise you this, you'll find answers. Meet me at the observatory tomorrow. Assal stared at the screen, her heart racing. The observatory. That word alone stirred memories late nights watching stars with her father, tracing constellations, wondering what lay beyond. She had mentioned the message to Nagin and Nikta earlier that day, hoping for clarity. Instead, she received two very different responses. Nagin was her usual playful self. You have to go. This is a chance to do something epic. If it turns out Voss is a mad scientist, even better. Imagine the stories. Nikta, ever the pragmatist, folded her arms. What if this whole thing is a waste of time? Or worse, dangerous? Voss isn't exactly known for safety protocols. Assal smirked at the memory. Her friends balanced her, each pulling her in a different direction. They were her compass, keeping her grounded and off-kilter all at once. But this decision, this was something she had to do for herself. She closed her laptop, her mind made up. Whether Dr. Voss was a mad scientist or a genius, she was about to find out. And if there were bubbles that defied the simple rule of becoming spheres, she would find them. The next day, Assal arrived at the observatory, tucked away on the outskirts of the city, its dome gleaming beneath the soft orange of the setting sun. Dr. Ilara Voss stood waiting at the entrance, her silhouette sharp and impatient against the glow. You came, Voss said, her voice brisk but approving. I had a feeling you would. Assal shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant despite the excitement bubbling inside her. Curiosity, I guess. Voss smiled, a flicker of warmth passing through her otherwise analytical demeanor. Good. Curiosity is the best compass you'll ever have. The two walked inside, the air thick with the smell of metal and ozone. Machines buzzed and whirred around them, their purpose mysterious and mesmerizing. Assal's eyes landed on a peculiar structure at the center of the room, a transparent sphere, slowly spinning on a platform, glowing faintly from within. That, Voss said, following her gaze, is the gateway. Through that sphere, we will explore universes where geometry takes on forms you've never imagined. Assal stepped closer, mesmerized by the shifting lights within the sphere. And what makes you so sure these places exist? Voss tilted her head, a sly smile playing on her lips. Because, Assal, they have to. The universe loves variety. It's just that we've only seen one version of it. The air around them seemed to hum with potential. Assal reached out to touch the sphere's surface, feeling a strange warmth beneath her. Fingertips, as if the universe on the other side was calling her. This was it, the journey she had longed for, the adventure her father had always hinted at. Are you ready to leave everything you know behind? Voss asked. Assal met her gaze, her heart steady. I've been ready for a long time. With that, the sphere's glow intensified, and the room seemed to fold inward. The rules of the familiar world began to blur, and Assal knew there was no turning back now. She had answered the call to adventure, and whatever lay beyond that sphere, she was ready to face it. Chapter 2. Entering the Cubical Universe. The hum of the gateway filled the room, vibrating through Assal's bones as the transparent sphere shimmered with light. Dr. Voss gave a satisfied nod, stepping back from the controls. Ready? She asked, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Assal felt a mix of excitement and fear. She turned to Nagin and Nikta, both watching from a safe distance. Nagin grinned mischievously, flashing a thumbs up. Nikta gave her a more restrained, worried look, but didn't say anything. Assal knew Nikta was concerned. This was uncharted territory. Dr. Voss interrupted her thoughts. The first universe we'll explore has some interesting anomalies. Gravity operates differently there, aligning along fixed axes. In short, everything is cubical. Cubical bubbles? Assal raised an eyebrow. That sounds like an oxymoron. Not when surface tension behaves differently, Voss said. You'll see. The machine flared, and before Assal could second-guess herself, the world folded inward. For a moment, she felt weightless, as if falling through the cracks between universes. Then everything snapped back into place. Assal blinked and found herself standing on what looked like the surface of a vast, glossy plain. The ground beneath her was perfectly flat and reflective, dividing into clean, symmetrical squares. "Whoa," she whispered. Above her, the sky was a patchwork of cubes, some transparent like glass, others metallic and opaque. Floating within each cube were smaller, rotating bubbles. They drifted slowly, their smooth faces reflecting light in precise angles. As she stared, Assal realized these weren't bubbles in the way she understood them. They were cube-shaped, with sharp edges and flat surfaces. "Welcome to the cubical universe," Voss said, adjusting her pack. "Here, gravity pulls toward the center of each cube. Surface tension, instead of pulling into a sphere, distributes force evenly along edges. It's geometry that governs everything here." Assal turned slowly, taking it all in. "So bubbles don't collapse into spheres because the forces balance perfectly along the lines?" "Exactly," Voss said, a little too smug. "You'll also notice that liquids here spread into thin, square sheets rather than droplets." Before Assal could reply, a voice called out from behind them. "Hello, strangers!" They turned to see a figure approaching, a slim being with angular features and deep-set eyes. His name was Kalen, and he was one of the native inhabitants of the cubical universe. He moved with an odd, deliberate grace, as if his body responded to the world's angular logic. "You don't belong here," Kalen said, though his tone was friendly. "How did you find this place?" Voss smiled. "We're explorers, curious about how things work beyond our world." Kalen gave her a slow, thoughtful nod. "You'll find that everything here is precise. Nothing bends and nothing flows in curves. Our lives are built on symmetry and edges." Assal couldn't help but marvel at how everything down to Kalen's clothing and posture reflected the geometry of the world. Even his expressions seemed carefully aligned, like emotions folded into neat compartments. As they walked, Kalen led them toward a strange structure, a massive floating cube, with smaller ones orbiting it in perfect formation. "We call this the core," Kalen said. "It's where the most stable bubbles exist. Our world depends on maintaining balance here. If the forces were to shift, the entire structure would collapse." Voss leaned toward Assal. "Fascinating, isn't it? This is a place where even emotions seem to fit into tidy shapes." "Or where emotions are suppressed," Assal whispered back. "If everything has to stay in balance, what happens when someone doesn't fit the mold?" Kalen overheard and gave a sad smile. "You learn to adapt, or you disappear." His words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. They continued walking, and Assal couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The cubical world was beautiful in its precision, but it felt cold. It reminded her of the moments when she tried to live up to impossible expectations, when everything had to fit into neat little boxes. As they neared the core, Assal turned to Kalen. "Have you ever wondered if there's another way? A world where things aren't so perfect?" Kalen paused, his gaze distant. "Sometimes, but perfection is safety. Without these edges, we would unravel." "That sounds more like fear than perfection," Assal murmured. Voss cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with the philosophical turn the conversation was taking. "We didn't come here to critique their way of life." "Maybe not," Assal said. "But if we're exploring alternate realities, we should understand them fully, flaws and all." They reached the core, and Kalen gestured for them to step closer. As they did, the floating cubes shifted slightly, aligning with their movements. The bubbles within glowed softly, as if alive with potential energy. Voss stared in awe. "The energy distribution here is perfect." That's the problem, Assal whispered, almost to herself. It's too perfect. Nothing can survive like this forever. Kaylin's expression darkened. You're right. There are fractures, tiny, imperceptible cracks, and when they grow large enough, this world will shatter. Assal felt a chill run down her spine. Perfection, it seemed, came with a price. That night, as they prepared to leave the cubicle universe, Assal sat quietly, watching the strange, angular bubbles drift in the sky. Do you think there's a way to save this place? She asked Voss. Voss shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe it doesn't need saving. Maybe some worlds are meant to collapse. Assal frowned. That's a pretty cold way of looking at things. It's just reality, Voss said. Not every bubble can last forever. As the gateway opened and the world began to fold in on itself, Assal took one last look at the cubicle sky. For all its beauty, she knew it wasn't a place she could ever belong. Perfection wasn't sustainable, not in this world, and not in her own. But the journey was just beginning. There were more universes to explore, more shapes to discover. And maybe, somewhere out there, she would find a bubble that didn't need to be perfect to be beautiful. Chapter 3. The Conical Realm of Extremes. The world unfolded around them in sharp lines and steep angles. Assal gasped as gravity pulled her forward, almost toppling her down a narrow slope. Dr. Voss steadied her, gripping her arm just in time. Careful, Voss said with a grin. Gravity here doesn't behave the way you're used to. Assal took a moment to regain her balance. They stood on the side of a massive cone, a towering peak rising sharply above them, with the land sloping downward in every direction. The ground was solid rock, jagged and unforgiving, glowing faintly in the orange light of a distant sun that hovered permanently low in the sky. Gravity pulls toward the apex, Voss explained. No matter where you are, the force drags you toward the center of the peak. It's a challenge to stay upright. Assal planted her feet carefully, testing the strange force that felt both familiar and alien. Every step required effort, as if the ground wanted to tip her over and drag her toward the sharp summit. This place feels oppressive, Assal muttered. Life here is a constant climb, Voss replied, literally and figuratively. From the distance, two figures approached, their movements smooth despite the steep angles of the terrain. They were Lyra and Darrow, twin explorers who had spent their entire lives navigating the conical world. Lyra moved with reckless speed, leaping between rocks with effortless precision, while Darrow followed more cautiously, his steps measured and deliberate. "Welcome to the apex," Lyra said with a grin as she landed in front of them. "You're lucky we found you before gravity did." Darrow gave a polite nod. "It's easy to get lost here. The force draws everything to the center, but not everyone makes it that far." Voss smiled. "That's why we're here to understand how things survive in a world like this." Lyra shrugged. "Survival isn't complicated. You climb or you fall." Assal frowned. "What happens if you reach the top?" Lyra laughed, a sound as sharp as the rocks beneath their feet. "You don't. There is no top, just the illusion of one. The closer you get, the steeper it becomes." Darrow glanced at Lyra. "Some believe the apex is more than just a place. It's a state of mind, an unreachable ideal." Voss's eyes sparkled with intrigue. "Like perfection." "Something like that," Darrow said. "But perfection is dangerous here. The higher you climb, the harder the fall." The journey up the cone was grueling. Every step felt like a battle against the invisible force pulling them toward the peak. The air grew thin, and the sharp rocks cut at their hands and feet. Lyra darted ahead with ease, her body perfectly attuned to the harsh environment. Darrow stayed close to the group, offering guidance and support when the terrain became too treacherous. Assal struggled, frustration building with every misstep. "How do you live like this?" she asked, panting. "Always climbing, never reaching the top." "You get used to it," Darrow said softly. "You learn that the climb is the only thing that matters. The apex doesn't exist, not really." Lyra shouted from above. "It's all about balance. If you push too hard, you fall. If you stop moving, you get dragged down." Assal thought about the bubbles she had seen in the cubicle world, perfectly contained and stable. This place was the opposite, unstable, relentless, always shifting. Yet, somehow, life persisted here. "What happens when someone falls?" Assal asked quietly. "They either learn to climb again," Darrow replied, "or they disappear." As they climbed higher, the sky darkened and the wind picked up, howling through the narrow crevices. The summit loomed above them, impossibly steep, as if daring them to keep going. Voss seemed exhilarated by the challenge. "This world is a metaphor," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It's about the pursuit of an ideal always out of reach, but worth the effort." Assal wasn't so sure. The climb felt endless, and the thought of never reaching the top weighed heavily on her mind. What was the point of chasing something you could never have? "Not everything has to be a metaphor," she muttered under her breath. Darrow gave her a knowing look. "Sometimes the climb is just a climb." They stopped to rest on a narrow ledge, the wind whipping around them. Below, the landscape stretched out in jagged ridges and deep valleys, a labyrinth of impossible angles. Assal could feel the gravity pulling her toward the peak, like an invisible hand guiding her toward something she couldn't quite see. Lyra sat cross-legged on the edge of the ledge, grinning. "You know what's funny? Some people spend their whole lives trying to reach the apex, only to realize there's nothing up there." "Why bother then?" Assal asked, feeling exasperated. "Because it's the only way to survive," Lyra said simply. "If you stop climbing, you fall." Voss leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "It's like the bubbles. They don't choose to be spheres. They become spheres because it's the only way they can exist. The same with this world. The climb is part of the fabric of existence." Assal stared at the distant summit, a strange mix of awe and frustration swirling inside her. She thought of her father's words. "Find the bubble that doesn't follow the rules, and it will change everything." "Maybe not everything has to make sense," she said quietly. "Maybe some things just are." Darrow smiled. "Now you're starting to understand." As they prepared to leave, Assal looked out over the vast, conical landscape one last time. The wind carried Lyra's laughter and Darrow's quiet wisdom down the slope, blending into the rhythm of the world itself. For a moment, Assal felt a strange sense of peace. The climb didn't need to have a purpose. It was enough just to keep moving, to keep searching, even if the summit was always out of reach. "Ready?" Voss asked, her hand on the gateway device. Assal nodded. "Yeah, let's see what other shapes the universe has to offer." The air shimmered and the world folded inward. As the conical realm vanished behind them, Assal knew the journey was far from over. There were more worlds to explore, more mysteries to unravel. And somewhere out there, she would find the bubble that defied the rules. Chapter 4, Pyramidal Worlds and Sharp Truths. The air shifted as the portal hummed open, folding the fabric of space around Assal and her companions. When the dizziness faded, they found themselves at the base of a colossal pyramid. Its sharp edges cut through the sky, each face sloping steeply toward a gleaming apex far above. The gravity here pulled differently aligned with the flat surfaces rather than a central point. It was as though the universe was forcing everything to conform to the strict lines and angles of the pyramid. "This place feels rigid," Assal muttered, running her hand along the smooth, cold surface of the pyramid. "It is," said Ika, an elder being from this world. He emerged from the shadows, his robes draping around him like folded paper, each movement calculated and precise. "In this world, everything has its place. If it doesn't fit, it breaks." Voss looked intrigued. "A world of order," she said, almost in admiration. "It's more than order," Ika said. "It's necessity. Our existence depends on every piece aligning perfectly. When one part shifts, the whole structure collapses." Assal frowned. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," Ika said with a thin smile, "but it's also beautiful." As they climbed the pyramid, the characters began to clash. Voss admired the precision of the pyramid's structure, marveling at how every element fit together without flaw. "This is how a universe should work," she said. "Everything in its proper place." Assal shook her head. "But where's the freedom? Where's the space for mistakes?" Voss gave her a sharp look. "Mistakes are weaknesses. If we could eliminate them, imagine what we could achieve." Assal felt a spark of anger rise. "My father used to say that mistakes are what make us human. You can't just eliminate imperfection. Maybe that's why humans are stuck," Voss shot back, "clinging to imperfection like it's some kind of virtue." Kaelin, who had been listening quietly, stepped between them. "Both of you are missing the point," he said. "This isn't about right or wrong. It's about survival. In this world, perfection is the only way to stay alive. Or the only way to keep people afraid," Assal muttered. Kaelin's expression darkened. "What's the difference?" They reached a narrow plateau halfway up the pyramid, the apex looming above them like a distant promise. Lyra stretched out, her carefree attitude an irritating contrast to the tension growing between Assal and Voss. "You two argue too much," she said with a grin. "It's just a world. Doesn't have to be a metaphor for everything." "It's more than a metaphor," said Professor Thorne, who had been silent until now. "This world forces us to confront our assumptions. What if the only way to survive is to conform? Is individuality worth risking collapse?" Assal bristled. "Conforming to survive isn't living, it's just existing." Voss folded her arms. "You're romanticizing chaos. Not every world has the luxury of disorder." Lyra laughed. "I think you're both overthinking it. Some people survive by climbing, others survive by sitting still. It's all the same in the end." Darrow, standing beside her, added quietly, "Not everyone survives, though." As they continued their ascent, the tension simmered beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Assal found herself growing frustrated, not just with the world around her, but with her companions. Voss's obsession with order, Kaelin's fatalism, Lyra's indifference, they all grated against her in different ways. "You don't have to agree," Negan whispered, walking beside Assal. "You just have to keep moving." "That's the problem," Assal muttered. "I don't know if I want to move in the same direction as them." Near the summit, the pyramid's sharp edges began to tremble, the structure shifting under their weight. Ika stopped abruptly. "We need to be careful," he warned. "Even the slightest misstep could bring the whole thing down." "Then maybe the pyramid isn't as perfect as it looks," Assal said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Nothing ever is," Darrow replied softly. The summit was within reach, but the path was narrow and steep, each step a test of balance and resolve. The tension between Voss and Assal reached a breaking point. "You think every world needs to be messy and unpredictable," Voss snapped. "But not every mistake is beautiful, Assal. Some mistakes are dangerous. And some rules are prisons," Assal shot back. "You can't keep everything in a box." Kaelin intervened, his voice sharp. "Enough. We all have choices to make. The pyramid doesn't care if you reach the top or not. It just exists. The question is, can you exist within it?" At the summit, they found nothing but an empty plateau. The apex was not a prize to be claimed, only an illusion of one. "It's just empty," Assal whispered. "That's the point," Ika said softly. "The journey isn't about reaching the top. It's about what you learn on the way." Voss looked dissatisfied, as though the pyramid had cheated her. Assal, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe, she thought, the lesson wasn't about perfection or imperfection. Maybe it was about learning to let go of both. As they descended the pyramid, the arguments and tensions began to ease, replaced by quiet reflection. Voss remained distant, lost in her thoughts, while Assal walked beside Kaelin, feeling the weight of the journey settle over her. "Do you think the pyramid is a failure?" she asked him. Kaelin shrugged. "Depends on how you look at it. Some see failure, others see freedom." Assal smiled. "I think I'm starting to get it." As the gateway shimmered into existence, ready to take them to the next world, Assal took one last look at the pyramid. It was beautiful in its own way, not because it was perfect, but because it didn't need to be. "Ready?" Voss asked, her voice softer than before. Assal nodded. Yeah, let's see what else the universe has to offer. Chapter 5, Flat Worlds and Disk-like Universe. The gateway opened once again, and the group found themselves in freefall, plunging through what seemed like endless space, with no ground in sight. For a moment, panic gripped Assal as she flailed, grasping at the air. Then, with a sudden lurch, everything snapped into place. They landed with a splash on a surface that felt like water, but it wasn't. The ground was a smooth, shimmering plain of liquid that rippled beneath their feet, spreading in endless circles across a flat horizon. Gravity pulled downward, but only just enough to keep them from drifting away. Everything felt strange here. No slopes, no peaks, only an unbroken expanse as far as the eye could see. Weird, Lyra said, crouching down to touch the surface. It looks like water, but it doesn't move like it. Voss took out a scanner, her eyes sharp with curiosity. That's because it's not water. It's something denser, like a plasma locked into a liquid state. Why's everything flat? Assal asked, still disoriented. This world rejects depth, Voss explained. No curves, no peaks, just endless two-dimensional planes. Even gravity is weaker. The bubbles here will stretch into disks instead of spheres. As if on cue, a cluster of bubbles floated toward them. They were thin, almost paper-like, shimmering with iridescent hues as they drifted lazily through the air. Assal reached out and touched one only to watch it shatter instantly, scattering droplets across the liquid surface. They're fragile, Darrow observed quietly. Everything here feels fragile. They wandered across the endless plain, their reflections shimmering in the strange liquid beneath them. The thin gravity made each step feel like a bounce, giving the entire world an unsettling weightlessness. As they walked, tension simmered just beneath the surface. Assal felt the strain between herself and Voss deepening with every passing moment. Voss seemed obsessed with understanding the flat world's mechanics, while Assal found herself questioning the purpose of it all. What was the point of a world where everything lay flat, without edges or boundaries? You know what bothers me? Assal said aloud, breaking the silence. This world has no beginning and no end. How do you make sense of that? You don't have to make sense of it, Voss replied, not looking up from her scanner. It just exists. That's exactly the problem, Assal muttered. It's like nothing here matters. Maybe it doesn't, Voss said flatly. Maybe meaning is just something we project onto things. Lyra rolled her eyes. Here we go again. The further they ventured, the stranger the flat world became. Light bent oddly across the horizon, creating mirages of distant cities that vanished as they approached. The liquid beneath their feet occasionally rippled with mysterious vibrations, as if something massive stirred beneath the surface. What happens if we fall in? Nagin asked nervously, kicking at the liquid with the toe of her boot. You won't fall, Kaelin said. There's no down here, just out. That's comforting, Nycta muttered. As they continued walking, a low hum began to vibrate through the liquid beneath them. The bubbles floating overhead began to twist and stretch, forming long, ribbon-like structures that spiraled through the air. This place is changing, Darrow said quietly. The rules are shifting. Assal felt a knot tighten in her chest. What does that mean? Voss frowned at her scanner. It means we need to move faster. This world is unstable. It might fold in on itself at any moment. Panic began to spread through the group as the ripples beneath their feet grew stronger. The once still surface churned with unseen currents, pulling at their feet. The bubbles overhead twisted violently, elongating into spirals that whipped through the air like serpents. We need to find the gateway, Voss said sharply. Now! They ran across the shifting surface, the gravity flickering with every step. Assal felt her frustration boiling over as the fragile world around them crumbled. This is pointless, she shouted, her voice echoing in the thin air. Every world we visit is just another broken place pretending to be perfect. That's the nature of the universe, Voss snapped. There is no perfection, only adaptation. Then what are we even searching for? Assal demanded. Why keep chasing something that doesn't exist? Voss stopped abruptly, turning to face her. Because the journey matters, even if the end doesn't. Their argument was interrupted by a violent tremor that ripped through the flat plain. The liquid surface split open, revealing a black void beneath. The bubbles above them shattered, scattering into fragments that dissolved into mist. "Run!" Kaelin shouted, pulling Assal along as the ground gave way beneath their feet. They sprinted across the collapsing world, their reflections shattering like glass with every step. The gateway shimmered into view ahead of them, flickering like a dying star. "Go!" Voss shouted, shoving the others toward the portal as the world folded inward, collapsing into itself. One by one, they leapt through the gateway, the flat world vanishing behind them in a rush of light and sound. They landed in a heap on the other side, gasping for breath. The familiar hum of the gateway filled the air, grounding them once more in reality. Assal lay on her back, staring up at the ceiling, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. "What was that place?" Negan asked, her voice shaky. "A lesson," Voss said quietly, brushing dust from her coat. "About the fragility of meaning." Assal sat up slowly, wiping sweat from her brow. "And what's the lesson?" Voss gave her a tired smile. "That even flat worlds can break." Chapter 6. The Role of Gravity and Other Forces. The gateway shimmered closed behind them, leaving the group in silence. The air was heavy, almost pressing against their skin, as though gravity was trying to prove a point. They stood on a strange landscape, neither flat nor steep, but subtly shifting, as if gravity itself couldn't decide which direction to pull. Dr. Voss pulled out her scanner, eyes gleaming with excitement. "This place is perfect for studying gravity's effect on form. See how everything changes as the force adjusts itself." "Perfect," Assal muttered sarcastically. "Another broken world." Kaelin crouched down, placing his hand on the unstable ground. "It's not broken," he said softly. "It's flexible." "Flexible," Lyra laughed. "That's one way to put it. Feels more like a bad trip." "Gravity here is dynamic," Voss explained, scanning the area. "It fluctuates, pulling in different directions based on mass and motion. That's why nothing stays in one shape for long." Ahead of them, bubbles drifted in strange, fluid forms, elongating, shrinking, bending as if trying to escape invisible hands that twisted them from every angle. They never stabilized, always in motion, responding to the fluctuating gravity. Assal watched them with a mix of fascination and frustration. Why do these worlds always feel like metaphors? Professor Thorne, who had been silent for most of the journey, gave a quiet chuckle. "Because they are. Everything is a metaphor if you think about it long enough." As they moved deeper into the shifting landscape, the ground beneath their feet tilted and curved, making it difficult to walk in a straight line. Assal stumbled, catching herself on Kaelin's arm. "This world is like trying to walk on a trampoline," she muttered. "It forces you to adapt," Kaelin said, "just like life." "That's easy for you to say," Assal replied, brushing herself off. "What happens if you can't adapt?" "Then you fall," Voss said matter-of-factly, "and the world moves on without you." The bluntness of her statement stung, but Assal kept her thoughts to herself. She knew Voss saw everything through the lens of science form, function, and failure. But Assal couldn't help but wonder what was missing from that perspective. "Gravity isn't just a force," Assal said, almost to herself. "It's personal. It pulls things together. It keeps them connected." Voss gave her a curious glance. "You're romanticizing it." "Maybe," Assal replied, "but not everything can be measured in data points." They reached a point where the gravitational field grew even more erratic, bending light and distorting shapes. Bubbles drifted by, warping into impossible forms, spirals, tesseracts, even jagged polygons. Negan stared at them, fascinated. "It's like the universe is experimenting, trying to find the right shape." "Or just enjoying the chaos," Lyra added with a grin. Darrow shook his head. "It's unsettling. There's no stability here." "Stability is overrated," Voss said with a shrug. "Adaptability is what matters." Assal shot her a look. Do you ever stop reducing everything to science? Voss smiled thinly. Do you ever stop romanticizing chaos? The tension between them was palpable, hanging in the air like the distorted bubbles drifting past. Kaelin stepped between them, trying to ease the conflict. You're both right, in your own way. Science and emotion aren't enemies. They're just different ways of making sense of the same thing. Tell that to gravity, Assal muttered as the ground beneath them shifted once again. As they navigated the unstable terrain, Professor Thorne spoke up, her voice thoughtful. Gravity is a force, yes, but it's also a metaphor. It holds things together, but it can also crush. It's a reminder that every connection carries weight. That's poetic, Darrow said softly, and true. Assal glanced at Voss, expecting a sarcastic comment, but the scientist seemed lost in thought. For once it seemed, even Voss was starting to see the world in shades of grey rather than black and white. They reached the heart of the gravitational field, a place where the forces converged, creating a swirling vortex of light and matter. Bubbles formed and dissolved in rapid succession, their shapes defying all logic. This is it, Voss whispered in awe, the purest form of gravitational influence. Assal stared into the vortex, feeling a strange sense of peace. It was chaotic, yes, but there was also something beautiful about the way everything moved together, like a dance where every misstep still led to something meaningful. Maybe the point isn't to find the perfect shape, Assal said quietly. Maybe it's about learning to move with the imperfections. Voss glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Maybe. For the first time, it felt like they had reached a fragile understanding, a moment where science and emotion, logic and feeling met in the middle. The vortex began to collapse, the gravitational field unraveling as the forces realigned. The bubbles dissolved into mist, and the landscape flattened beneath their feet. It's time to go, Voss said, activating the gateway. As they stepped through the portal, Assal took one last look at the chaotic beauty of the gravitational field. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive, moving, shifting, evolving. And maybe, she thought, that was enough. Chapter 7, Friendships and Fractures. The portal left them in darkness, thick and suffocating, as if the air itself was made of shadows. Slowly, a faint glow began to spread across the ground, revealing a landscape made entirely of mirrored surfaces. Every step the group took created infinite reflections, each distorted slightly from the next, stretching into endless versions of themselves. Where are we? Assal whispered, staring at the countless copies of herself reflected in the smooth ground below. Somewhere between here and not here, Professor Thorne murmured, her voice carrying a strange, distant calm. This world doesn't seem to follow any fixed geometry. Great, Lyra muttered. Another place that breaks all the rules. As they moved through the mirrored landscape, their reflections shifted, sometimes falling out of sync with their movements. Assal caught glimpses of herself older, younger, versions with slight but unsettling changes. In one reflection, she looked calm and serene, while in another she wore an expression of deep sadness. These aren't just reflections, Darrow whispered. They're possibilities. Possibilities? Assal asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. Darrow nodded slowly. Reflections of who we could become if things had gone differently. The strange reflections seemed to stir something in the group. As they wandered through the shifting landscape, old arguments resurfaced, tensions long buried bubbling to the surface. You think everything is a metaphor? Voss snapped at Assal, her frustration finally breaking through. Not every shape has to mean something. And you think everything can be explained away with equations? Assal shot back. But what if it can't? Then it's meaningless, Voss replied sharply. If we can't understand it, it might as well not exist. Kaelin sighed, stepping between them again. You two are like mirrors reflecting each other's frustrations. Maybe try looking past the surface for once. The group pressed on in uneasy silence, each member lost in their own thoughts. Assal couldn't shake the feeling that the reflections were more than just visual tricks. They felt like glimpses into alternate versions of herself, versions shaped by different choices, different worlds. Negan fell into step beside her, her playful energy dampened by the weight of the strange landscape. "You okay?" she asked, nudging Assal gently. Assal shook her head. "I don't know, I feel disconnected, like I'm not sure who I'm supposed to be." Nikta walked on the other side of her, adding quietly, "We've all felt like that at some point. Maybe this place is just amplifying what's already inside us." As they journeyed deeper into the mirrored world, they came upon a strange sight, a massive floating bubble, perfectly spherical and glowing faintly with light. Unlike the chaotic bubbles they'd seen before, this one seemed stable, serene. But as they approached, it began to change, shifting into new shapes, a cube, a cone, a pyramid, before returning to its original form. "It's like it's trying to decide what it wants to be," Assal whispered. "Or it's showing us that it can be all those things at once," Thorn mused. "Identity isn't fixed, it's fluid." The bubble's transformations reminded Assal of something familiar, something elusive. "It's like Alice," she murmured, half to herself. Voss glanced at her. "Alice?" Assal nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place in her mind. "In Alice in Wonderland, nothing stays the same for long. Identities shift, rules change, and everything feels off, like it's on the edge of making sense but never quite does. This," she gestured to the shifting bubble, "feels like that. Interesting comparison," Thorn said thoughtfully. "Perhaps we're all just wandering through a wonderland of our own making, trying to make sense of things that defy logic." Voss rolled her eyes. "Or maybe we're overthinking it." Assal smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe we're exactly where we need to be." They stood in silence, watching the bubble shift and change, each transformation more beautiful and strange than the last. For a moment, the group seemed united, not in understanding, but in shared wonder. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. But the calm didn't last. As the bubble shifted once more, it fractured, splitting into countless smaller bubbles that floated away in every smaller bubbles that floated away in every direction. The reflections on the ground shattered with it, each mirror fracturing into jagged shards. The group stood amid the wreckage, their own reflections fragmented and scattered across the landscape. "What now?" Lyra asked, her usual bravado muted. "We move forward," Voss said firmly. "There's nothing else to do." "And what if there's nothing ahead?" Assal challenged. Voss turned to her, her expression unreadable. "Then we create something." The gateway shimmered open again, offering a way out of the mirrored world. As they stepped through, Assal felt a strange sense of clarity. Not because she had found answers, but because she had accepted that not every question needed one. They emerged on the other side, the hum of the gateway fading behind them. The air felt lighter. The tension between them eased, if only slightly. For the first time in a long while, Assal felt like she could breathe. "We're almost there," Voss said, her tone softer than before. Assal nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Almost." Chapter 8, Love, Loss and Geometry. The gateway left them on the shores of an ocean that stretched infinitely in all directions. But this was no ordinary ocean. Its waves moved in geometric patterns, perfect squares rising and falling in rhythmic cycles, forming tessellated ripples that spread across the water's surface. "Everywhere we go, things refuse to behave," Negan murmured as she crouched by the edge, watching square-shaped waves roll onto the shore. Nikta kicked a pebble into the water, and instead of sinking, it hovered just below the surface, suspended as if caught between two dimensions. "We keep looking for meaning in chaos," Voss said, standing at the water's edge with her arms crossed. "But maybe we need to let go of that need. Maybe some things just are." Assal stared at the strange ocean, her mind spinning. "No," she said quietly. "I can't believe that. There has to be meaning. There's always meaning." Kaelin, standing beside her, gave a small, sad smile. Sometimes we create meaning because we can't bear to live without it. The ocean reminded Assal of the many conversations she'd had with her father talks that circled endlessly around the same themes. Life, mistakes, love. He had always told her that mistakes were part of being human, that perfection was a myth. She could hear his voice now, as if he were standing beside her. One day, you'll find a way to make sense of all this, Assal. And when you do, it'll feel like coming home. But standing on the shores of this impossible ocean, she felt farther from home than ever. The weight of his absence pressed against her, making it hard to breathe. Negin noticed the change in her friend's demeanor. "You okay?" Assal shook her head, brushing away tears that had begun to form. "It's just, this place makes me think of him." Nikta placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's still with you, you know. In every question you ask, every answer you chase." Assal gave a small, grateful nod, but the ache remained. As they ventured further along the geometric shore, the characters' emotions began to fray. Every encounter with these strange worlds seemed to pull something different from each of them. Hopes, fears, frustrations, and it was becoming harder to keep those emotions contained. Lyra, always the first to crack a joke, was unusually quiet. Darrow seemed lost in thought, as if the patterns of the ocean held some hidden meaning just for him. Kaelin, ever the guide, looked weary, as though the weight of the journey was finally catching up with him. And then there was Voss, always searching, always analysing, as if understanding the mechanics of the universe could protect her from its unpredictability. "You can't measure love," Assal said suddenly, breaking the silence. Voss glanced at her, brow furrowed. "What? Love, loss, regret. You can't quantify them. They don't fit into neat equations." Voss's expression hardened. "That doesn't mean they're beyond understanding." "Some things are beyond understanding," Assal insisted. "That doesn't make them meaningless." For a moment, the two women stood in silence, locked in a quiet battle of wills. Kaelin watched them both, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "You're both right," he said softly, "and you're both wrong." They came upon a series of strange structures rising from the water towers built from interlocking bubbles, each one shaped like a different geometric form. The bubbles shimmered in the fading light, forming patterns that seemed to defy logic. "Beautiful," Thorne whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's as if the universe is trying to tell us something. Or maybe it's just showing off," Lyra said with a grin. Voss shook her head, still frustrated. "We keep trying to impose meaning on everything we see, but what if there is no meaning? Then why does it feel so important?" Assal asked. "Why do we keep searching?" Voss opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. For once, even she didn't have an answer. As the sun began to set, though it was unclear whether this world even had a sun, the group sat together on the shore, watching the square waves roll in and out. The tension between them had softened, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. Negin leaned her head on Assal's shoulder. "We'll figure it out, one way or another." Nikta smiled. "Maybe the answer isn't out there somewhere. Maybe it's been inside us all along." Lyra rolled her eyes playfully. "Great, now we're officially in a self-help book." Darrow chuckled. "Could be worse. We could be stuck in a pyramid again." Even Voss allowed herself a small, reluctant smile. "At least this place has waves." Assal looked out at the geometric ocean, feeling a strange sense of peace. The answers were still elusive, and the journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, she felt okay with that. Because maybe, just maybe, the meaning wasn't in the destination. Maybe it was in the journey itself. Chapter 9. The Hyperbolic Puzzle. The gateway opened, and the group stumbled forward into a world that seemed to spiral endlessly outward. The ground beneath them was uneven, curving in ways that defied logic, as if the very fabric of space twisted and folded upon itself. Every direction felt like both an ascent and a descent at the same time. "This is disorienting," Assal muttered, pressing a hand to her temple to steady herself. Voss's eyes gleamed with excitement as she scanned the warped landscape. This is hyperbolic space, a world where every point curves, away from every other point. Nothing here is parallel, and the farther you move, the more space you create. That makes no sense, Nicta said, squinting at the horizon, which seemed to stretch farther away the longer she stared at it. It's not supposed to, Kaelin replied quietly. That's the beauty of it. They wandered through the strange landscape, their footsteps echoing faintly in the twisted air. The world around them seemed alive, shifting and expanding with every movement, as though the act of walking created more space rather than covering ground. I feel like I'm going in circles, Nagin said, frustrated, but somehow also getting nowhere. Welcome to the hyperbolic puzzle, Thorn murmured, her voice tinged with awe. This is a place where the concept of distance breaks down. The more you try to reach the edge, the farther away it becomes. The strange geometry of the hyperbolic world began to affect the group in unexpected ways. Conversations grew tense, small frustrations magnifying into sharp arguments. The disorienting nature of the landscape seemed to amplify their doubts and insecurities. We're just going in circles, Lyra muttered, her usual bravado slipping. What's the point of any of this? The point is to understand, Voss snapped. If we figure out how this place works, we can... Can what? Assal interrupted, her voice rising. Prove something. To whom? Why does it even matter? Voss rounded on her. It matters because understanding is the only way to survive. If we stop trying to figure things out, we might as well give up. Maybe giving up isn't the worst thing, Assal shot back. Maybe not everything needs to be solved. Enough, Kaelin shouted, stepping between them. We're losing ourselves in this place. Can't you see that? The group fell into uneasy silence, the tension between Assal and Voss lingering like a shadow. They continued walking, each lost in their own thoughts, as the hyperbolic landscape twisted and expanded around them. At one point, they came upon a massive spiral of bubbles, each one connected to the others in a seemingly infinite chain. The bubbles were translucent, glowing faintly with soft, pulsing light. As the group approached, the bubbles began to shift, forming complex geometric patterns that seemed to reflect the hyperbolic nature of the world. This place is endless, Darrow whispered, his voice filled with both awe and fear. There's no center, no edge, just infinite expansion. That's the puzzle, Voss said quietly. In a world without boundaries, how do you find meaning? You don't, Assal replied softly. You just keep moving. As they stood beneath the spiral of bubbles, the group began to reflect on their journey so far. Every world they had visited, cubical, conical, pyramidal, flat, had challenged their understanding of reality, forcing them to confront both external and internal conflicts. I used to think that understanding the universe would make everything easier, Voss admitted quietly. But the more we learn, the more complicated things become. That's because the universe doesn't care about being understood, Thorn said. It just is. Assal looked up at the endless spiral of bubbles, feeling both small and strangely at peace. Maybe it's not about understanding, she said. Maybe it's about accepting that some things will always be out of reach. The hyperbolic landscape shifted once again, twisting and folding upon itself, creating new paths that spiraled into infinity. The group stood at a crossroads, unsure which direction to take. We could walk forever and still never reach the edge, Darrow said quietly. Then what do we do? Lyra asked, her voice laced with frustration. Just stand here and wait? No, Assal said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. We move forward, not because we'll reach the end, but because moving forward is what we do. For the first time in a long while, Voss didn't argue. She simply nodded, a flicker of understanding passing between her and Assal. The group continued walking, their steps lighter, their arguments quieted. The hyperbolic world no longer felt like a puzzle to be solved, but a journey to be experienced. As they moved deeper into the twisted landscape, the bubbles around them began to shift, forming patterns that echoed their thoughts and emotions. It was as if the hyperbolic world had become a mirror not of their actions, but of their souls. For the first time, Assal felt at peace with the uncertainty. She didn't need all the answers. It was enough to keep moving, to explore, to wonder. And in that moment, the hyperbolic world felt less like a maze and more like a home. Chapter 10. Cracks in Reality. The gateway delivered them into a world that looked familiar, too familiar. Assal stood still for a moment, disoriented. They were standing in a space that resembled the cubicle universe, but something was off. The symmetry that had once defined it was gone, replaced by jagged cracks running through the floating cubes. "Why are we back here?" Assal asked, glancing at Voss. "We aren't," Voss replied grimly, staring at the broken cubes. "This isn't the same world. It's falling apart." The air felt heavy with tension, and the cracks in the landscape seemed to pulse, growing larger with every passing moment. Bubbles drifted through the air, some cubical, some spherical, others collapsing into shapeless forms as if unsure what they were meant to be. "This shouldn't be happening," Voss muttered, her hands trembling as she scanned the environment. The boundaries between the worlds. They're breaking. "How is that even possible?" Nicta asked, her voice tight with fear. Kalen shook his head, a grim expression on his face. "Maybe we pushed too far. Maybe some things weren't meant to be explored." The ground beneath them trembled as cracks spread like veins, cutting through the fractured cubes and spreading into the sky. The bubbles overhead collided and shattered, their fragments spiraling into the widening voids. "This whole place is unraveling," Darrow said quietly, his voice tinged with both awe and fear. "Then we need to move," Voss said sharply. "Now." But the cracks were everywhere, spreading faster than they could run. The very fabric of space seemed to warp, pulling them in different directions. "This isn't just one world collapsing," Thorne said, her voice filled with dread. "It's all of them." As they raced through the crumbling landscape, old tensions resurfaced, sharpened by the collapsing environment. Assal felt anger bubbling inside her, directed not just at Voss, but at herself, at the universe, at everything that refused to make sense. "This was supposed to give us answers," Assal shouted, dodging falling debris, "but all it's done is tear everything apart." "Maybe that's the point," Voss shouted back, her voice raw with frustration. "Some questions don't have answers. Maybe we were fools for thinking they did." The group came to a halt at the edge of a massive chasm, the void below stretching endlessly. The air felt thin, as though the very concept of space was dissolving. "We can't keep running," Kalen said, panting. "There's nowhere left to go." Assal looked at the crumbling landscape around them, feeling a strange sense of clarity. "Then we have to stop trying to fix it," she said quietly. "We can't hold everything together. We have to let it break." Voss stared at her, disbelief written across her face. "You're saying we just give up?" "No," Assal replied. "I'm saying we let go." In that moment, the tension between Assal and Voss broke, not with a shout, but with a sigh, a shared realization that neither of them could control the chaos. The cracks in the landscape seemed to respond to this shift, slowing, as if waiting. "Letting go doesn't mean giving up," Thorne said softly. "It means accepting what is and what isn't." The group stood in silence, watching the world crumble around them, and somehow, in that moment, it felt okay. The bubbles that had once fought to maintain their shapes dissolved into mist, drifting peacefully into the void. The cracks stopped spreading, leaving the shattered landscape suspended in stillness. Voss took a deep breath, her hands steady for the first time since the journey began. "We need to leave." The gateway shimmered open, and one by one, the group stepped through, leaving the broken world behind. On the other side, they stood in silence, each of them processing the journey in their own way. The cracks between worlds might have stopped spreading, but the fractures within themselves would take longer to heal. Assal glanced at Voss, a tentative smile forming on her lips. "We made it." Voss smiled back, the weight of the journey reflected in her eyes. "Yeah, we did." Chapter 11. The Return to the Sphere. The gateway opened with a flash, and the group stepped into a world that felt strangely familiar. They stood on soft, uneven ground, the air warm and heavy with the scent of rain. Overhead, the sky was painted in muted shades of blue and grey, with clouds drifting lazily across it. But something felt different. Assal turned slowly, her eyes scanning the landscape. They were back in a world that looked like their own, a world shaped by spheres, curved lines, and familiar forms. But there was an uneasiness in the air, as if reality itself was holding its breath. "This looks normal," Nagin whispered, glancing around. "Looks can be deceiving," Kaelin muttered, adjusting the strap of his bag. Voss crouched down, running her hand across the damp ground. "The geometry here is stable," she said, "but something's off, the balance, it's fragile." It was then that Assal noticed the bubbles floating gently through the air, ordinary, spherical bubbles, just as she remembered from her childhood. They rose slowly toward the sky, carried by an unseen breeze, drifting upward until they popped with soft, inaudible bursts. "There's something different about these bubbles," Assal murmured. "They're too perfect." Voss gave her a curious glance. "You're finally complaining about spheres." "I'm serious," Assal said. "They're not supposed to be this perfect. It's like the world is trying too hard to hold itself together." As they moved deeper into the landscape, the tension between the characters began to ease, replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. Every step through this familiar yet unfamiliar world felt like walking through a dream, one that could dissolve at any moment. "This place feels incomplete," Thorne said thoughtfully, "like a story that hasn't reached its ending yet." "Maybe that's what it is," Kaelin replied, "a story waiting for us to finish it." For once, Voss didn't argue. She seemed subdued, lost in thought as she watched the bubbles drift through the air, their perfect forms hinting at something just out of reach. They came upon a small, still lake at the centre of the landscape. The water was calm, reflecting the sky above with flawless precision. But when Assal reached out to touch the surface, the ripples that spread were strange, jagged, angular, as though the water was trying to imitate the sharp edges of the cubical world. "Nothing stays the same," Assal whispered, "even in a world of spheres." Voss knelt beside her, her gaze distant. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe every world, every shape is just another version of the same thing. An endless cycle," Thorne added. "Shapes changing, evolving, collapsing, only to start over again." Assal stared at the ripples, feeling both comforted and unsettled by the thought. "Then what are we supposed to do?" "Keep going," Kaelin said quietly. "That's all we can do." The group sat in silence by the lake, each of them lost in their thoughts. The journey had taken them through impossible worlds, bending the rules of space, time, and identity. But now, at the edge of this seemingly perfect world, they were left with more questions than answers. Nagin leaned back, watching the bubbles drift across the water. "Do you think we'll ever find what we're looking for?" "I don't know," Assal admitted. "But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the search is what matters." Voss gave her a small, rare smile. "Now you sound like a scientist." Assal laughed softly, the tension between them finally easing. For the first time, it felt like they were all on the same page, not because they had found answers, but because they had learned to live with the questions. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the landscape, the bubbles in the air seemed to shimmer, reflecting the colours of the sky. "What happens now?" Lyra asked, breaking the peaceful silence. "We leave," Voss said simply, "and we let the bubbles float wherever they want." Assal smiled, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. "Maybe that's the secret," she said, "not trying to control everything, just letting things be." The gateway hummed to life, and one by one they stepped through, leaving the world of spheres behind. On the other side, they stood together in the familiar hum of the laboratory, the air still and quiet. It felt like they had been gone for an eternity, yet only moments had passed. Assal glanced around at her companions, feeling a strange sense of gratitude. They had made it through impossible worlds, faced their fears, argued, fought, and grown. And now, standing together at the end of the journey, they were no longer just travelers. They were friends. Voss looked at her with something close to admiration. "You did well," she said quietly. "So did you," Assal replied, her voice warm. As the group dispersed, Assal lingered by the gateway, watching as the machinery powered down. The journey was over, but she knew the questions would stay with her, just as the bubbles would keep floating, changing and evolving long after they were gone. And that, she thought, was okay. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. Not because she had found the answers, but because she had learned to live with the uncertainty. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Chapter 12. The climax bubbles within bubbles. The air around the group shimmered with an otherworldly hum, vibrating through their skin and bones. They stood at the edge of a space unlike any they had seen before, a place where every universe they had visited seemed to overlap, merging into one. Bubbles of every shape imaginable floated in chaotic patterns, intersecting, folding, and spiraling into one another. "It's like all the worlds are colliding," Nagin whispered, her wide eyes reflecting the chaos in the bubbles around her. "This is the heart of everything," Professor Thorne murmured. "The source, or the end, or both." Assal took a step forward, feeling the strange gravity pulling her in multiple directions at once. Some bubbles were spherical and familiar, others cubical, conical, pyramidal, and flat impossible geometries all coexisting, breaking apart and forming again. Kaelin stared at the bubbles with quiet awe. "Bubbles within bubbles," he said softly, "layers of existence folding into one another." As they ventured deeper into this swirling nexus, the pressure of the conflicting forces began to weigh on them, physically and emotionally. The ground beneath their feet dissolved into fragments, reforming with each step, as if responding to their thoughts and doubts. Every bubble that popped sent ripples of tension through the air, mirroring the fractures within the group. "I don't like this," Nycta said, her voice tight with anxiety. "It feels like we're being undone." Voss kept her gaze fixed on the shifting bubbles, her expression unreadable. "This is what happens when the boundaries collapse. We've crossed too many worlds. Now everything is trying to balance itself." "So what do we do?" Darrow asked, his calm demeanor fraying at the edges. "We figure it out," Voss replied sharply, "like we always do." Assal shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's your answer for everything, but maybe this isn't something we can fix." Voss glared at her. "So what do you suggest? That we just stand here and let everything fall apart?" "Maybe," Assal shot back. "Maybe things need to fall apart." The argument sparked like a match, igniting tensions that had simmered throughout their journey. "You've been trying to control everything from the start," Assal continued, her voice rising. "But not everything needs to be controlled. Some things just are." "And you've been romanticizing chaos," Voss snapped. "Not every mess is beautiful, Assal. Some things need structure, or they fall apart." "Maybe falling apart isn't the worst thing," Assal said, her voice raw with emotion. "Maybe that's how things grow. Or maybe it's just how they break," Voss muttered bitterly. Kaelin stepped between them, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Enough," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're missing the point." "The point," Thorne added, "is that all these shapes, all these worlds, they aren't competing. They're complementing each other. They exist together." Assal took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The bubbles around them shifted in response, their shapes softening, as if they too were finding a fragile balance. "So the answer isn't to choose one shape over the others," Assal said slowly. "It's to let them all exist, to accept every version, even the broken ones." Voss gave her a long, searching look. For a moment, it seemed like she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped, and a tired, reluctant smile tugged at her lips. "You might be right." The world around them pulsed with energy, the bubbles converging into patterns that reflected their newfound understanding. Spheres nestled within cubes, cones intersected with pyramids, and flat planes folded into spirals. all existing side by side in an intricate dance of balance and contradiction. "This is it," Thorn whispered, awestruck. "This is the meaning we've been searching for. Not perfection, but coexistence." The bubbles glowed brighter, their forms stabilizing as if in agreement. The air felt lighter, the tension easing as the group stood together, united not by answers, but by acceptance. Then the bubbles began to drift apart, gently, as if signaling the end of their journey. One by one, they floated upward, carrying fragments of each world they had visited. The cubical universe, the conical peaks, the pyramidal truths, the flat worlds, and the chaotic hyperbolic space, all woven into a single tapestry of existence. Assal watched them go, a soft smile on her lips. "I think we're ready to leave." Voss nodded. "Yeah, I think we are." The gateway opened one final time, and the group stepped through, leaving the bubble-filled nexus behind. On the other side, they found themselves back in the quiet hum of the laboratory, the air still and familiar. For a moment, none of them spoke. The weight of the journey lingered in the silence, a shared understanding that words could never fully capture. Then Negan broke the silence with a grin. "That was weird, but kind of amazing." Nicta chuckled. "That's one way to put it." Voss glanced at Assal, her expression softer than it had been since the beginning. "You were right," she said quietly, "about letting go." Assal smiled. "And you were right about holding on. I think we needed both." The group slowly dispersed, each person carrying the lessons of the journey in their own way. Kaelin lingered by the doorway, giving Assal a knowing smile. "See you on the next adventure." Assal nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "Yeah, see you then." As the others left, Assal stayed behind for a moment, watching the bubbles that still floated gently through the air. They weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. Because in the end, it wasn't about perfection, it was about acceptance, about letting every shape, every moment, every version of herself exist flawed, beautiful, and whole. And with that thought, she smiled and walked toward the door, ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 13. The Collapse of Certainties. The gateway opened, and the group stepped into a world suspended on the edge of reality. The air was thick with possibility, and every movement rippled through space, creating echoes that seemed to stretch forward and backward in time. "This place feels heavy," Assal whispered, pressing a hand to her chest. It wasn't just the atmosphere that weighed on her, it was everything. Every regret, every unspoken word, every missed opportunity pulled at her like an invisible force. "That's because this world responds to emotion," Thorn said softly. "It amplifies what you carry with you." As Assal exhaled, a ripple spread from her feet, the ground shifting into sharp, angular patterns, broken shapes that reflected her grief like cracked glass. "This place is pulling us apart," Darrow muttered, watching as strange currents swept through the landscape, scattering fragments of shapes cones colliding with spheres, spirals twisting into jagged polygons. "It's not just pulling," Kaelin said, his voice low. "It's reflecting. Our choices, our thoughts, even our emotions, they're shaping this world." The group moved cautiously through the shifting landscape, each step reshaping the space around them. Spheres drifted overhead, crumbling into spirals as soon as they touched one another. The ground beneath their feet twisted into endless fractals, as if the world couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. "I think it's showing us what we're afraid to see," Negan whispered, her eyes wide as the terrain flickered with fragments of memories and unspoken fears. As they walked, Assal felt the gravity of her father's absence pressing down on her, pulling at her heart like a tide. She could almost see him in the distance, a flickering shape on the horizon, just out of reach. For a moment, she felt as though time folded in on itself, and she was standing beside him again, listening to his voice as he told her, "It's okay to make mistakes, Assal. Just keep moving." The memory slipped away as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her breathless. "This world isn't stable," Voss said, her voice strained. "We need to keep moving." The landscape shifted again, folding in on itself until the group found themselves standing at a crossroads, surrounded by the shapes they had encountered on their journey cubes, cones, spheres, and pyramids. A massive spiral twisted upward into the sky, and flat plains hovered above them like invisible doorways. "It's giving us a choice," Voss said, staring at the shapes. "We have to decide which path to take." "But what if we don't want to choose just one?" Assal asked. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, and the shapes around them seemed to respond, growing heavier and more distorted with every passing second. "The longer we wait, the harder this will get," Voss muttered. "We need to commit to something." The emotional gravity in the air thickened, pulling each of them toward different shapes. Lyra drifted toward the spiral, drawn to its endless motion. Darrow stood quietly beside a perfect sphere, his hand resting on its smooth surface, as if searching for something familiar. Assal stood frozen, her mind spinning. Every shape called to her, each one offering a different version of herself, a life defined by order, freedom, stability, or chaos. She felt time fracture around her, fragments of possible futures flashing before her eyes. A life spent chasing perfection, a life embraced in chaos, a life filled with regret, and another where regret didn't exist at all. "This isn't just a choice of shape," Thorne whispered. "It's a choice of who we become." The weight of the decision pressed harder, and the world trembled beneath their feet. Fractures spread through the air, and the shapes began to collapse into one another. Time seemed to splinter, showing them countless futures spiraling outward, each one shaped by a different version of themselves. "I can't do this," Nagin whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "What if we choose wrong?" "There is no wrong choice," Kaelin said gently. "There's just the next step." Assal took a deep breath, feeling the pull of the spiral, the weight of the sphere, and the jagged edges of every choice she had ever made. And in that moment, she realized something. "We don't have to choose," she said softly. "We can carry every shape with us, every mistake, every triumph, every moment. It's all part of who we are." The world around them began to shift, the shapes dissolving and reforming, as if the universe had heard her words and agreed. The cubes folded into spheres, the spirals straightened into lines, and every possibility merged into a single, fluid reality. "We carry all of it," Voss whispered, a rare smile softening her features. "That's the answer, isn't it?" Assal nodded. "It's not about picking the perfect shape, it's about learning to live with all of them." The emotional gravity that had weighed them down began to lift, and the time fractures smoothed into gentle currents. The air grew lighter, and the landscape shimmered, folding back into the fabric of the universe. "It's time to go," Darrow said quietly. Voss activated the gateway, and the group stepped through, leaving the collapsing world behind. On the other side, they stood in the familiar hum of the laboratory. The air was still, but something had changed, not in the world, but within each of them. "We made it," Nagin whispered. "Yeah," Assal said, a quiet smile forming on her lips. "We did." Voss glanced at her, the tension between them finally gone. "And maybe we found something along the way." Assal grinned. "Maybe." The group began to disperse, each person carrying the journey with them in their own way. Kaelin lingered for a moment, giving Assal a playful smile. "See you on the next adventure?" Assal laughed softly. "Count on it." As the others left, Assal stayed behind for a moment, watching a single bubble drift lazily through the air. It wasn't perfect. It wobbled slightly, reflecting every shape they had encountered. And as it floated upward, she realized that it didn't need to be perfect, because in the end, it wasn't about finding the perfect shape. It was about embracing every version of the story, every bubble, every path, every choice. And with that thought, she smiled and walked toward the door, ready for whatever came next. Chapter 14. Waking to a World Beyond. Imagine, if you will, that you wake up to a world where the shapes that once defined your existence have unraveled. Time bends into loops, emotions shape reality, and every step you take dissolves the path behind you. This is a world not meant to be understood, only lived. Assal opened her eyes and found herself standing alone in a field of mist. There was no ground beneath her feet, only the suggestion of it, like a memory that refused to settle into place. The air shimmered with the glow of distant bubbles. Some spherical, others jagged, each one carrying a fragment of a different world. "It feels like a dream," she whispered, though no one was there to hear her. But then the mist shifted and the others emerged. Kaelin, Negin, Nicta, Voss, Thorn and Darrow, all of them moving slowly, as though waking from the same dream. "This place," Kaelin murmured, staring at the drifting bubbles. "It's not any of the worlds we've seen." "It's every world," Thorn replied, "and none of them." The group stood in silence, watching as the bubbles floated lazily through the mist, each one reflecting pieces of the journey they had taken. Cubes twisting into spirals, pyramids folding into spheres. Time itself seemed to ripple around them, not moving forward, but expanding outward. Assal stepped toward one of the bubbles, peering into its shifting surface. Inside, she saw fragments of her father. His voice, his laughter, the moments they had shared, and the ones she wished she could change. For a fleeting second, it felt as though she could reach inside and pull him into the present, bringing him back from the unreachable past. "He's still with you," Kaelin said gently, stepping beside her. "I know," Assal whispered, "and that has to be enough." The bubble drifted away, and Assal let it go, watching as it merged with others, forming new patterns in the air. Voss stood nearby, her expression softer than Assal had ever seen. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said. "How everything falls apart, and yet somehow it all fits together." Assal smiled. "Like a puzzle with no edges." The group moved slowly through the mist, each of them quiet, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. As they walked, the bubbles formed paths around them, guiding their steps without leading to any specific destination. "It's not about where we end up," Darrow said quietly. "It's about the moments we pass through on the way." Negin nodded, "and carrying those moments with us." The mist began to thin, revealing a horizon that stretched endlessly in every direction. There were no gates, no doors, no walls. Only space, open and infinite, waiting to be filled with whatever came next. "This isn't an ending," Voss whispered. "It's a beginning." Assal stood at the edge of the mist, feeling the lightness of possibility settle over her like a second skin. For the first time in a long while, she felt free, not because she had found answers, but because she no longer needed them. "Everything we are," she murmured, "exists between what we know and what we can't understand." Kaelin gave her a knowing smile. "That's the beauty of it, isn't it?" Assal nodded, her heart full. "Yeah, it is." As the group stood together at the edge of this strange, borderless world, a single bubble floated toward them, shimmering with the light of every choice they had made, every world they had seen. It hovered between them, waiting, as if offering one final question. "What will you carry forward?" Without hesitation, Assal reached out and touched the bubble. It wobbled slightly, as if laughing at the absurdity of its own existence, then drifted upward, dissolving into the endless sky. "We're ready," Voss said quietly, her voice filled with quiet certainty. And with that, the group stepped forward into the unknown, into the infinite, no longer searching for answers, but simply moving, together, through whatever came next. Chapter 15. Perspectives from the Minds That Shape Reality. In the final days of their journey, the group gathered in the laboratory, their minds still spinning from the impossible worlds they had travelled through. To make sense of it all, Assal found herself searching through books, articles, and notes, pieces of knowledge left behind by the great thinkers of their time. "Maybe it's not just us who wonder about these things," Assal said, holding up a tattered book by theoretical physicist Michio Kaku. "People have been asking these questions for centuries." Michio Kaku, Multiverses and Alternate Realities. According to Kaku, Voss began, flipping through the book, there could be an infinite number of universes, each with its own physical laws. She glanced at Assal. That means everything we saw, cubical, conical, hyperbolic worlds, could actually exist. They're not just imagination, they're mathematical possibilities. Assal leaned forward, intrigued. Kaku believes that our universe might just be one bubble among many, like a foam of bubbles floating in the higher dimensional space of the multiverse. Kaelin chuckled softly. Bubbles within bubbles, I guess we were onto something. Stephen Hawking, The Boundaries of Time and Space. Thorne pulled out another book, this one by Stephen Hawking. Hawking once suggested that the universe doesn't have a boundary, that time and space are finite, but unbounded. Imagine living on the surface of a sphere. There's no edge to fall off, but it's still finite. Like one of the worlds we saw, Darrow murmured, a perfect sphere, looping endlessly. Hawking also argued that black holes might not destroy information, Thorne added thoughtfully. Instead, the information could be stored in the event horizon, a boundary where the rules of physics blur. Just like in the hyperbolic world, Assal said, where everything twisted and folded, but nothing was truly lost. Lisa Randall, Hidden Dimensions and Gravity's Role. Voss held up a journal article by physicist Lisa Randall. Randall's work suggests that there could be extra dimensions folded within our universe dimensions that affect gravity and the way we experience space. That's why gravity felt so strange in some of the worlds, Assal said, nodding. Like the conical and pyramidal universes, each one shaped by forces we couldn't fully understand. And maybe, Voss continued, those forces like gravity aren't just physical, they could be emotional too. Our emotions shape our perception of reality, just like gravity shapes physical objects. Carlo Rovelli, Time as an Illusion. Nicta skimmed through a book by Carlo Rovelli. Rovelli argues that time might not exist the way we think it does. Instead of being a constant flow, time could be an emergent phenomenon, something that appears only when we try to measure it. Assal smiled. That fits with what we saw, the way time shifted and stretched in some of the worlds. It's like the act of measuring time created the illusion of it moving. So, Kaelin said thoughtfully, if time isn't real in the way we think, then maybe mistakes and regrets don't carry as much weight as we believe. They're just moments. Alan Lightman, The Intersection of Science and Meaning. Darrow flipped through a collection of essays by physicist and novelist Alan Lightman. Lightman writes that science and spirituality don't have to be at odds. Both are ways of trying to make sense of the universe, one through logic, the other through experience. Assal felt a warmth spread through her chest. That's what we've been trying to do all along, isn't it? Make sense of what we've seen, not just with science, but with our hearts. Discussion. A world beyond logic. As the group shared what they had learned from these thinkers, the boundaries between science and story began to blur. Each theory, each idea felt like another piece of the puzzle, a way of understanding the impossible worlds they had travelled through. It's comforting to know that we're not alone in our questions, Nagin said. Even the greatest minds wrestled with these ideas. And maybe, Voss added, the point isn't to find one answer. Maybe it's about learning to live with multiple truths. Assal smiled. Like a universe full of bubbles, each one holding a different version of reality. Closing thoughts, a universe of questions. The discussion wound down, and the group sat together in silence, the hum of the laboratory grounding them in the familiar. They knew their journey wasn't over. There would always be more questions, more shapes to explore, more worlds to imagine. Every shape we saw, every world we visited, Assal whispered. It's all connected. Science, philosophy, emotion. They're just different ways of looking at the same thing. Epilogue. Beyond the horizon of understanding. The journey had ended, but the questions lingered. Assal stood alone on the balcony of the laboratory, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Above her, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, tiny glowing spheres floating in the darkness. each one a distant world filled with possibilities. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had seen and learned settle within her. Not as answers, but as memories, emotions, and fragments of truth. The others had gone their separate ways, each carrying the experience with them. Negan and Nicta were already planning their next adventure. Darrow and Thorn had quietly slipped away, content with the knowledge they had gained. Voss had stayed behind just long enough to share a rare moment of understanding with Assal, a truce forged not from agreement, but from mutual respect. Kaelin had smiled knowingly as he left, leaving Assal with the words, "See you on the next journey." And now, standing under the night sky, Assal found herself thinking not of endings, but of beginnings. The stars above seemed different somehow, brighter, closer, as if the boundaries between worlds had grown thinner. It was comforting to think that somewhere out there, new shapes were forming, new universes unfolding like bubbles drifting through space. And maybe, just maybe, she thought, every question is just a doorway to another journey. She closed her eyes and thought of her father, his voice clear in her mind as though he were standing beside her. "You don't have to know everything, Assal," he had once told her. "Just keep going, the meaning will find you." She smiled, feeling his presence not as a ghost or a memory, but as a part of herself. A quiet reminder that life wasn't about finding perfect answers, but about embracing the imperfect, the unknown, and the unexpected. Opening her eyes, Assal gazed at the stars again, wondering how many more worlds were waiting just beyond the edge of sight. How many more shapes would they encounter? How many more questions would they ask? It didn't matter. The journey would continue in one form or another because life itself was a journey, a series of moments unfolding, each one as fleeting and fragile as a bubble. And that, she thought, was enough. As she stood in the stillness of the night, a single bubble floated past her, shimmering softly in the moonlight. It wobbled slightly, its surface reflecting the world around it, the stars, the night sky, and Assal herself, standing quietly beneath it. She reached out and touched the bubble gently, watching as it drifted upward, rising into the endless sky. Beyond the horizon of understanding, the bubbles would keep floating, and Assal too would keep moving through questions, through moments, through life. Because in the end, the only thing that mattered was the journey. And in the end, Voss added, maybe that's enough. Epilogue, beyond the horizon of understanding. The journey had ended, but the questions lingered. Assal stood alone on the balcony of the laboratory, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Above her, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, tiny, glowing spheres floating in the darkness, each one a distant world filled with possibilities. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had seen and learned settle within her, not as answers, but as memories, emotions, and fragments of truth. The others had gone their separate ways, each carrying the experience with them. Negan and Nicta were already planning their next adventure. Darrow and Thorn had quietly slipped away, content with the knowledge they had gained. Voss had stayed behind just long enough to share a rare moment of understanding with Assal, a truce, forged not from agreement, but from mutual respect. Kaelin had smiled knowingly as he left, leaving Assal with the words, "See you on the next journey." And now, standing under the night sky, Assal found herself thinking not of endings, but of beginnings. The stars above seemed different somehow, brighter, closer, as if the boundaries between worlds had grown thinner. It was comforting to think that somewhere out there, new shapes were forming, new universes unfolding like bubbles drifting through space. And maybe, just maybe, she thought, every question is just a doorway to another journey. She closed her eyes and thought of her father, his voice clear in her mind as though he were standing beside her. "You don't have to know everything, Assal," he had once told her. "Just keep going. The meaning will find you." She smiled, feeling his presence not as a ghost or a memory, but as a part of herself. A quiet reminder that life wasn't about finding perfect answers, but about embracing the imperfect, the unknown, and the unexpected. Opening her eyes, Assal gazed at the stars again, wondering how many more worlds were waiting just beyond the edge of sight. How many more shapes would they encounter? How many more questions would they ask? It didn't matter. The journey would continue in one form or another because life itself was a journey, a series of moments unfolding, each one as fleeting and fragile as a bubble. And that, she thought, was enough. As she stood in the stillness of the night, a single bubble floated past her, shimmering softly in the moonlight. It wobbled slightly, its surface reflecting the world around it, the stars, the night sky, and Assal herself, standing quietly beneath it. She reached out and touched the bubble gently, watching as it drifted upward, rising into the endless sky. Beyond the horizon of understanding, the bubbles would keep floating, and Assal too would keep moving through questions, through moments, through life. Because in the end, the only thing that mattered was the journey.